Has China Won? This video is based on key insights from the book Has China Won? By Kishore Mahbubani. Introduction. Kishore Mahbubani begins by stating one thing is certain. The competition between America and China will continue for many years. This isn't just about President Trump, even though he started it in 2018. Both Democrats and Republicans in America agree that China poses a threat. Even top military leaders, like General Dunford, believe China will be a major challenge by 2025. The US government even calls China and Russia powers trying to change the world order. The FBI director, Christopher Wray, thinks dealing with China requires everyone in America to work together, and even someone who disagreed with Trump, George Soros, praised Trump's tough stance on China. However, Mahbubani points out something strange. Despite this widespread agreement, America didn't plan carefully before starting this competition. He recalls a conversation with Henry Kissinger, a very experienced American strategist, who hinted that America lacked a long-term plan. Kissinger's own book, On China, supports this idea. Mahbubani contrasts this with the Cold War, when America spent a lot of time thinking and planning before confronting the Soviet Union. George Kennan created a strategy called containment to deal with the Soviet Union, and he did this while working on long-term planning for the State Department. Mahbubani notes that when he worked for Singapore's government, he learned the importance of asking the right questions first. If you don't ask the right questions, your answers won't be helpful. He believes it's crucial to consider possibilities that might seem unlikely, as his former colleague, S. Rajaratnam, taught him. With this in mind, Mahbubani presents 10 important questions that American policymakers should consider. The first question concerns the size of the economies. Could China's economy become bigger than America's in the next 30 years? If so, America will need to adjust to not being the world's biggest economic power. The second question asks whether America should focus on improving life for its own citizens or maintaining its position as a world leader. Sometimes these goals conflict, and America needs to decide which is more important. Mahbubani then questions America's military spending. During the Cold War, high spending forced the Soviet Union to spend even more, which eventually weakened them. But China has learned from this and is focusing on economic growth instead of a massive military. Should America continue to spend so much on defense, or should it invest more in things like healthcare and infrastructure? Does China want America to spend more or less on its military? He also points out the importance of alliances. America won the Cold War with the help of its allies. To keep these allies, America was generous and kept its economy open to them. But the Trump administration's America First policy threatened tariffs on allies like the European Union and Japan. Can America build a strong coalition against China if it also alienates its friends? Was America's decision to leave the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, a mistake that benefited China? Has China already started building its own alliances through the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI? Mahbubani then focuses on the power of the US dollar. The dollar is essential for global trade, and America has used this power to impose rules and fines on other countries. But is it wise to use a global resource for its own benefit? Could China find a way to weaken the dollar's power? He believes this could be America's biggest weakness. He then discusses soft power, which is a country's ability to influence others through culture and values. America used to have a lot of soft power, but it has declined since 9/11 due to actions that violated international law and human rights. Can America regain its soft power and win the ideological battle with China? Mahbubani brings up a point made by H.R. McMaster, a former national security advisor, who said the struggle between America and China is between freedom and authoritarianism. However, he notes that many democracies, like India and Indonesia, don't feel threatened by Chinese ideology. He suggests America is making a mistake by treating China like the old Soviet Union. He also questions whether America's response to China is based on reason or emotion. He points out a historical fear in the West of a yellow peril, and suggests that this might be influencing the current situation. He wonders if American thinkers can even discuss this openly without facing criticism. Mahbubani then introduces the idea of understanding China's perspective. He suggests that the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, isn't just a communist party, but represents Chinese civilization itself. He asks whether Americans understand this, and whether they focus too much on ideology and not enough on China's long history and culture. He challenges Americans to try to think like Chinese leaders. Finally, Mahbubani contrasts Western chess, which focuses on quick wins, with the Chinese game of Wei Qi, which emphasizes long-term strategy. He wonders if China is slowly building up its power over time, and whether America is prepared for this long-term competition. He points out that America underestimated China in the past, such as when it tried to prevent allies from joining the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, A2B, and the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. Mahbubani emphasizes the need for a strategic debate and rational thinking. He asks a fundamental question: can America lose this competition? He believes that many Americans assume America will always win, but this isn't necessarily true. He points out that China is becoming stronger and that the world is changing. He warns that America needs to adapt to the new world order. He concludes by suggesting that China's civilization is regaining its strength after a long period of weakness. He shares his unique connection to many Asian cultures, which gives him a broader perspective on global affairs. He believes that many countries are now looking to China, not just America. He urges both America and China to consider the opinions of the rest of the world and to avoid actions that could lead to conflict. He hopes that through understanding and rational thinking, both sides can find a way to coexist peacefully. China's biggest strategic mistake. Kishore Mahbubani argues that China made a big mistake by upsetting many important groups in the United States and not thinking about what would happen as a result. He points out that when President Trump started a trade war with China, almost no one in America spoke up to defend China. This was very different from the 1990s, when companies protested when the U.S. tried to limit trade with China. Mahbubani finds it surprising that American businesses, who make a lot of money in China, didn't defend the relationship. He explains that businesses usually only care about profits. Many companies have made money in China, but they didn't speak out when Trump attacked China's trade practices. To understand why, Mahbubani looks at the success stories of companies like Boeing, General Motors, and Ford. Boeing, for example, has sold over 2,000 planes to China and makes a huge portion of its revenue from the Chinese market. China is so important to Boeing that it helped the company survive tough economic times. Even though Boeing only has one major competitor, Airbus, the success of American car companies in China is even more surprising because they don't usually do well against other car makers around the world. Mahbubani explains that GM's success in China is largely due to partnerships with Chinese companies. These partnerships give GM access to important connections within the Chinese government. He suggests that the Chinese government may have intentionally helped American car companies succeed, because they didn't want to rely only on European and Japanese cars. As a result, GM and Ford now make more money in China than they do in the United States. Despite this success, these companies didn't defend China when Trump started the trade war. Mahbubani contrasts this with the past, when American businesses actively lobbied to maintain good trade relations with China. He notes that in the 1990s, Boeing was a strong advocate for keeping trade open with China. However, in 2018, the American Chambers of Commerce in China reported problems like unfair competition, lack of transparency, and concerns about protecting their ideas and secrets. These issues, combined with a growing feeling that China wasn't playing fair, led to widespread support for Trump's actions, even from Democrats and commentators who usually disagree with him. Mahbubani believes that three main factors contributed to this change: local officials having a lot of independence, China becoming overconfident after the 2008 financial crisis, and weak leadership in China during the 2000s. During this period of rapid economic growth, the central government didn't pay enough attention to how foreign businesses were being treated at the local level. A Chinese saying, "The mountains are high and the emperor is far away," illustrates how difficult it is for the central government to control everything that happens in the provinces. He shares an example of a European company that signed an agreement to buy a Chinese company, but the Chinese company refused to sell when the time came. Despite appeals to local authorities and courts, the European company couldn't enforce the agreement. This shows how difficult it can be for foreign companies to navigate the Chinese system. Mahbubani also points out that, after the 2008 financial crisis, Chinese officials became more arrogant and confident, even telling others that China's way of doing things was better. This attitude, along with actions in the South China Sea, fueled criticism from the United States. He reminds readers of a piece of advice from Deng Xiaoping, a former Chinese leader, to be humble and patient as China grew stronger. He argues that China should have proactively addressed concerns about its trade practices and its status as a developing country within the World Trade Organization. While China benefited from being considered a developing country, it became the world's second-largest economy. Mahbubani suggests that China should have voluntarily given up some of these benefits to show good faith. He notes that even figures like Hank Paulson, a former U.S. Treasury Secretary who is friendly towards China, acknowledged that China needs to open its economy more to foreign competition. Paulson pointed out that many American businesses are frustrated with restrictions and unfair practices in China. Mahbubani concludes that China needs to change its mindset and become more open to the world. He suggests learning from Singapore, which has successfully attracted foreign investment by creating a welcoming environment for businesses. He believes that by becoming a champion of globalization, China can strengthen its relationship with the United States and the rest of the world, and continue its economic success. He warns that building walls and isolating itself, like the U.S. is attempting to do, will ultimately lead to decline. America's biggest strategic mistake. Kishore Mahbubani begins by suggesting that while the competition between the United States and China is ongoing, China currently holds an advantage. He believes the Trump administration made a mistake by starting a big global competition without a clear plan. This, Mahbubani argues, weakened America's position and unintentionally helped China grow its influence. Mahbubani points out that experts like Henry Kissinger and Fareed Zakaria agree that the U.S. lacks a solid strategy for dealing with China. For many years, the U.S. had a plan to bring China into the world community through trade and cultural exchange. However, as China became more powerful, the U.S. struggled to create a new plan. This is a stark contrast to how the U.S. approached its rivalry with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, when clear guidance was provided by strategic thinkers like George Kennan. The author notes that many Americans, including some Democrats, supported Donald Trump's trade and technology battles with China. However, Mahbubani argues that these actions often benefited China, despite seeming tough on the country. He explains that Trump's focus was often short-term, unlike Kennan's long-term thinking during the Cold War. Mahbubani emphasizes that a strong and united America would be a much bigger challenge to China. He references Kennan's idea that a country's power comes from appearing confident, successful, and having strong beliefs. However, Mahbubani believes Trump divided America and damaged its reputation. He acknowledges that America faces deep problems, even before Trump, making it appear less strong to the outside world. A key mistake, according to Mahbubani, was Trump's decision to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. He describes TPP as a smart move by the Obama administration to strengthen U.S. influence in Asia. By leaving TPP, Trump handed China an opportunity to expand its influence. Additionally, Mahbubani criticizes Trump for alienating important allies like Canada, Mexico, and countries in Europe and Asia with his unpredictable behavior. Mahbubani contrasts this with the early Cold War, when the U.S. built strong international organizations like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and NATO. Now, he says, China is taking the lead in creating new organizations like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, A2B, and the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. While the U.S. opposed these initiatives, many of its allies joined them, finding them well-managed and helpful. The author observes that under Trump, America appeared chaotic and unpredictable, while China presented itself as stable and reliable. He points out that Trump once claimed trade wars were good and easy to win, but evidence showed they hurt American consumers and the economy. Mahbubani highlights the lack of planning behind Trump's tariffs on Chinese goods, noting that even advisors tried to explain the negative consequences, but Trump insisted on them anyway. Mahbubani stresses that American economists have long taught the benefits of free trade and the drawbacks of tariffs. He's surprised that a U.S. president didn't understand these basic economic principles. He also notes that while China was frustrated by Trump's actions, it also benefited from his lack of long-term vision. The author then discusses the importance of the U.S. dollar as the world's main currency. He explains that the dollar's strength comes from the trust people have in the U.S. government to manage it responsibly. However, Mahbubani warns that Trump's actions are eroding that trust. He points to instances where the U.S. used its control of the dollar to punish other countries, like Iran, which led some nations to seek alternatives to the dollar. Mahbubani explains that China is exploring ways to reduce the world's reliance on the U.S. dollar, potentially through blockchain technology and a new digital currency. He believes that if many countries lose faith in the dollar, it could seriously harm the U.S. economy. He cautions that the U.S. is risking a valuable asset, the dollar's global status, by using it as a weapon. Mahbubani concludes that the lack of a long-term strategy stems from a deeper problem: America's unwillingness to question its own assumptions about its place in the world. He argues that America has long believed it will always be number one, and that it is inherently virtuous. He suggests that these beliefs prevent the U.S. from adapting to a changing world, much like the Qing dynasty in China failed to adapt to the rise of the West. He believes that unless America challenges these assumptions, it risks losing its position in the world to China. Is China expansionist? Kishore Mahbubani begins by challenging a widely held belief that Xi Jinping broke a promise not to build up the military on islands in the South China Sea. Many news sources, like the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and The Economist, reported that Xi went back on his word to President Obama. However, Mahbubani explains that the situation is more complicated. According to Ambassador Stapleton Roy, a well-respected expert on China, Xi actually offered a reasonable plan for the South China Sea, suggesting cooperation on existing agreements and talks about a new set of rules. It was the U.S. Navy's increased patrols that prompted China to start building up its military presence there, not a broken promise. This highlights how easily a story can become accepted as truth, even when the full picture is missing. Mahbubani points out that this misrepresentation isn't accidental. He believes a network involving intelligence agencies from the U.S., UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, known as the Five Eyes Club, plays a role. These agencies share information with major Western newspapers, which are generally independent and strive for truth. However, they often rely on these government sources, and sometimes crucial details are left out, shaping the narrative. For example, the fact that the U.S. Navy's actions influenced China's militarization wasn't widely reported. He illustrates this with an example of a delegation, including prominent journalists who visited Beijing and gained a different perspective, attempting to explain China's viewpoint. But this nuance often gets lost in the broader story. The author emphasizes that China isn't naturally aggressive. Historically, China hasn't been an empire focused on conquering other lands, unlike many European powers. He uses the example of Australia, which was colonized by Britain despite being much closer to China. Even when China had a powerful navy centuries ago, led by Admiral Zheng He, they didn't try to take over foreign territories. Instead, they focused on trade and establishing relationships. While Zheng He did engage in some battles, he didn't launch widespread conquests. This contrasts sharply with the Mongol Empire, China's northern neighbor, which built a vast empire through military force. Mahbubani argues that Chinese culture values scholars more than soldiers, influenced by the teachings of Confucius, who warned against valuing strength without morality. He contrasts this with American culture, which often celebrates military strength. He notes that China's focus is on protecting its borders and maintaining stability, as outlined in its defense policies. He believes the portrayal of China as an aggressive military threat is a misunderstanding, fueled by a lack of understanding of Chinese history and strategic thinking. He points to the Belt and Road Initiative as an example of China seeking to build relationships and influence through economic means, not military force. The author highlights a key difference between the US and China. America often believes it has a duty to spread its values globally, sometimes leading to military intervention, while China doesn't believe it needs to impose its culture on others. He uses the examples of Libya and Syria to show how America's desire to promote its values has led to involvement in conflicts that don't directly threaten its national interests. China, on the other hand, prioritizes its own interests and avoids unnecessary conflicts. Mahbubani suggests that America should be careful about wishing China would be more like it, referencing America's own history of expansionism under Theodore Roosevelt. Regarding Taiwan, Mahbubani explains that it's a particularly sensitive issue for China due to its history of being humiliated by foreign powers. He details how the West initially promised to return Taiwan to China after World War I, but then gave it to Japan, a betrayal that remains a sore point. He argues that America should respect China's position on Taiwan and avoid actions that could provoke a military response. He suggests that recognizing Taiwan's autonomy while discouraging independence would be a more sensible approach. He draws a parallel to the US's relationship with Cuba, noting that a more patient and understanding approach might be more effective. Finally, Mahbubani addresses the tensions in the South China Sea. He points out that the US's focus on freedom of navigation benefits China, as China is a major trading nation. The real issue is China's claim to territorial waters around the artificial islands it has built, which violates international law. He suggests that instead of provocative naval patrols, America should take China to the World Court to resolve the dispute legally. He concludes that China is unlikely to become an aggressive military power, and that America should focus on competing with China in non-military areas like economics and technology, and reconsider its current strategic consensus. Can America make U-turns? Kishore Mahbubani argues that the way the United States is acting in its competition with China is surprisingly similar to how the Soviet Union behaved during the Cold War. He points out that during the original Cold War, America was flexible and thoughtful, while the Soviet Union was rigid and stuck to its beliefs. The US often tried to work with other countries, while the Soviet Union mostly ignored what others thought. Now, Mahbubani believes the roles have reversed. The author explains that America seems to be repeating the mistakes of the past. Instead of being adaptable, the US is becoming inflexible, especially when it comes to military spending. Mahbubani suggests it doesn't make sense for the US to spend more and more on weapons, especially since a full-scale war with China is unlikely, and even a small fight could quickly escalate. He believes America has enough weapons already, and should focus on things like science and technology instead. He uses the example of aircraft carriers, noting that the US has 13 groups of them, and getting rid of even a few would save a lot of money. Each carrier group costs about $6.5 million per day to operate. Mahbubani highlights that this isn't about a lack of smart people making decisions, but about a system that's hard to change. The defense industry has a lot of influence, with factories located in many different states. Politicians are hesitant to cut spending because they don't want to lose jobs in their areas. This creates a cycle where weapons are bought not because they're necessarily needed, but because of political pressure. He points out that this wasteful spending actually helps China, as it drains American resources. In contrast, Mahbubani argues that China is making rational decisions about its military. They aren't trying to copy the US by building a huge number of expensive weapons. Instead, they're focusing on strategies that work for a country with less military power, like developing missiles that can destroy expensive US aircraft carriers. He explains that a Chinese missile costs only a few $100,000, while an aircraft carrier costs $13 billion to build. This is a much smarter way to spend money. The author details how a situation in 1996 actually led China to develop these strategies. When the US sent 2 aircraft carriers near Taiwan, China realized how vulnerable they were. This prompted them to create ways to defend themselves against US carriers, a strategy known as anti-access area denial. Mahbubani notes that the US protests this strategy, which unintentionally shows that it's effective. Mahbubani also points out that China isn't building up a huge stockpile of nuclear weapons, even though they could. They have enough to deter attacks, and they don't see the point in spending more money on weapons they likely won't use. He contrasts this with the US, which has a massive number of nuclear weapons but struggles to reduce them. The author then turns to the issue of military interventions. He argues that the US is making the same mistake the Soviet Union did by getting bogged down in conflicts like Afghanistan. While the Soviet Union struggled in Afghanistan, America has spent trillions of dollars in Afghanistan with little to show for it. Mahbubani believes the US should learn from this and avoid unnecessary wars. He criticizes the invasion of Iraq as a costly mistake that didn't serve American interests. Mahbubani suggests that after the Cold War, the US should have taken advantage of its victory and pulled back from global conflicts. Instead, it has become more involved in wars around the world. He points to a study showing that the US has been involved in more military interventions in the 25 years after the Cold War than in the 190 years before it. He believes this is due to groupthink, where everyone in Washington agrees on a certain course of action without really thinking critically about it. He acknowledges that America has many think tanks and experts, but argues that they aren't providing enough independent thought. He explains that there's a system in Washington where people benefit from increased military spending, creating a conflict of interest. This system is supported by defense contractors and lobbyists who want to keep the money flowing. Mahbubani believes that this groupthink is especially harmful when it comes to China. He argues that while China has been steadily growing, the US has been distracted by unnecessary conflicts. He suggests that America needs to change its approach and focus on diplomacy instead of military force. He uses the example of Southeast Asia, where peace and prosperity increased after the US withdrew from the region. He argues that America should learn from this and disengage from conflicts in the Islamic world, where it doesn't have a clear strategic interest. He criticizes the idea that America needs to be involved everywhere to maintain order, arguing that the world is becoming more civilized and doesn't need America to police it. He points to studies showing that violence and poverty are declining globally. Mahbubani believes that America's biggest mistake is its unwillingness to compromise and its belief that it always knows best. He notes that American ambassadorships are often given to political donors instead of experienced diplomats, which weakens America's diplomatic capabilities. Mahbubani concludes that America is becoming like the rigid Soviet Union, unable to adapt to changing circumstances. He warns that America's confidence in its own success could be its downfall. He challenges the common assumptions that America will always win, that communism will always fail, that America has unlimited resources, and that the world will always prefer America to China. He believes America needs to be realistic about the possibility of becoming number 2 and start making different choices. He suggests that a brave politician needs to start a conversation about what America would look like if it wasn't the world's sole superpower. but acknowledges that such a conversation would be politically difficult. Should China become democratic? Kishore Mahbubani begins by explaining how a small event, China removing term limits for its president, Xi Jinping, sparked a big reaction from the West. It was like dropping a pebble into a pond and watching the ripples spread. Many in the Western media immediately criticized the move, seeing it as a step back towards authoritarian rule, similar to the time of Mao Zedong. Publications like The Economist and Time expressed strong disapproval, suggesting China was moving away from modern governance and towards a more controlling system. Mahbubani points out that many American experts on China also felt betrayed. They had believed that as China became more involved with the world, it would naturally become more democratic. This idea was based on the assumption that democracy is the best way to govern and that it would eventually spread everywhere, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union. Hillary Clinton, for example, famously said China was trying to stop history, believing democracy was inevitable. However, Mahbubani argues that this belief was a mistake. Americans underestimated China's long and unique history. While the American Republic is relatively young, China's political culture stretches back thousands of years. This long history has taught the Chinese to prioritize stability and strong central control above all else, fearing chaos more than anything. They've seen periods of disunity and suffering, and they've learned that a strong leader is necessary to keep the country together. Mahbubani suggests that Xi Jinping's decision to remove term limits wasn't necessarily about personal power, but about preventing chaos. He highlights two major challenges facing China: internal divisions within the Communist Party and widespread corruption. These issues threatened the party's control, and Xi Jinping saw strong leadership as the solution. He wanted to ensure China remained stable and unified. The author notes that many Westerners struggle to understand this perspective. They assume that any undemocratic system is inherently evil. Mahbubani quotes Max Weber, a famous thinker, who said that good things can sometimes come from unexpected places. He argues that strong Chinese leadership, while not democratic in the Western sense, is actually delivering benefits to the world. Mahbubani identifies three global public goods that China is providing. First, it's controlling a strong sense of nationalism that could easily become aggressive. China has a history of being mistreated by foreign powers, and its people are proud of their country's resurgence. The CCP is keeping this nationalism in check. He points to historical events, like the destruction of ancient statues in Bamiyan by the Taliban, and compares it to the looting of Beijing by British and French troops in 1860, reminding readers that Western powers haven't always acted with perfect morality. Second, China is acting rationally in addressing global challenges, particularly climate change. While the U.S. withdrew from the Paris Agreement under President Trump, China remained committed, demonstrating a long-term perspective. Mahbubani emphasizes that China is now focused on developing an ecological civilization, prioritizing environmental protection. Third, China is behaving as a status quo power, meaning it's not trying to disrupt the existing world order. Unlike the US and the Soviet Union in the past, China isn't actively intervening in other countries or seeking to impose its ideology. Mahbubani uses the example of the South China Sea, suggesting that even China's actions there are relatively restrained compared to what the US might have done in a similar situation during its rise to power. Mahbubani acknowledges the criticism that China lacks political freedoms. However, he argues that the Chinese people prioritize social and economic well-being over political rights. He points out that the Chinese government has delivered unprecedented improvements in living standards for its citizens. He also notes that trust in the government is surprisingly high in China, unlike in many Western countries. He contrasts the Chinese approach with the often chaotic results of Western-backed color revolutions in other countries, arguing that these interventions often lead to instability and conflict. Mahbubani suggests that the West should recognize that China's system, while different, is working for the Chinese people. He believes that China's success is not about replicating Western models, but about finding its own path. Mahbubani concludes by emphasizing the importance of understanding China's unique history and culture. He argues that the Chinese Communist Party, despite its flaws, is a remarkably effective governing body. He suggests that Western policymakers should be open to the possibility that China's approach to governance might offer valuable lessons, and that a more nuanced understanding of China is crucial for navigating the complex relationship between the two countries. He believes that dismissing China as simply authoritarian ignores the benefits it brings to the world and underestimates its potential for future success. The assumption of virtue. Kishore Mahbubani argues that the biggest problem standing in the way of better relationships between the United States and China isn't about politics or trade, but something much deeper: how Americans see themselves. He believes many Americans assume their country is naturally good and better than others, a belief he calls the assumption of virtue. This idea, he explains, has been around for a long time, with leaders often describing America as a shining example for the world. Mahbubani points out that many Americans believe their country is special because of its values, its history, and its political system. Some even think America is destined to lead the world. However, he shares the opinion of scholar Stephen Walt, who suggests this belief is largely a myth. It's a comforting story, but not necessarily true. This assumption of virtue isn't just about thinking America has been a force for good in the world. It's also about believing that life in America is better than anywhere else. For a long time, this belief had a strong basis. Historically, people in America generally had a higher standard of living than those in Europe. After World War II, many Americans experienced a significant improvement in their lives. Mahbubani remembers watching American TV shows as a child in Singapore and being impressed by the comfortable lives of the families he saw. The world often looked to America as a model for success. However, Mahbubani argues that this period is over. He observes that thoughtful people around the world are noticing problems within American society. He highlights a key issue. The income of the bottom 50% of Americans has remained stagnant for 30 years, while incomes have risen in other major regions like the European Union and China. This means that while the wealthy have continued to get richer, many ordinary Americans haven't seen their financial situation improve. This stagnation has led to real hardship for many Americans, particularly among the white working class. Economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton describe a sea of despair among this group, linking economic struggles to problems like family breakdown, addiction, and health issues. Mahbubani asks what the influential philosopher John Rawls would think of this situation. Rawls believed a just society should focus on improving the lives of its least fortunate members. Mahbubani points out that America is now one of the most unequal societies in the world. The wealth gap between the richest Americans and the rest of the population is enormous, comparable to the disparity between a Roman senator and a slave. This inequality has grown significantly in recent decades. He notes that while inequality is increasing globally, it has risen to a greater extent in the United States than anywhere else. He suggests that America is becoming more like a feudal society, with a small, wealthy elite controlling most of the power and resources. Ray Dalio, a successful investor, has documented the decline in living standards for many Americans, noting that a large percentage struggle to afford even a small, unexpected expense. Mahbubani emphasizes that this situation challenges the traditional American belief in equal opportunity. Mahbubani explores why this has happened. He suggests two possibilities. Either this is a temporary setback, and America will recover as it has from past economic challenges, or there has been a fundamental shift in the American political system. He argues that while America maintains the appearance of a democracy, with regular elections, money has become a dominant force in politics. He explains that a Supreme Court decision allowed corporations and wealthy individuals to spend unlimited amounts of money influencing elections. This has led to a situation where politicians are more responsive to the interests of their donors than to the needs of ordinary citizens. Studies by Princeton University professors Martin Gilens and Benjamin Page show that the views of average Americans have little impact on policy, while the views of the wealthy have a significant influence. Mahbubani argues that this situation undermines the principles of democracy. He points to the work of scholars who have documented how wealthy donors are using their resources to shape political agendas and influence policy decisions. He notes that while Americans may believe they have the power to change their political system, the reality is that their votes are often overshadowed by the influence of money. He contrasts this with China, acknowledging that its political system is different and less open. However, he points out that the quality of life for many Chinese citizens is improving more rapidly than for many Americans. He suggests that the contest between the two countries isn't simply a competition between democracy and communism, but between a system that is becoming increasingly controlled by wealth and a system that, despite its flaws, is delivering better results for its people. Mahbubani concludes by suggesting that America needs to honestly assess its own strengths and weaknesses and be open to learning from other countries, including China, in order to revitalize itself. How will other countries choose? The world is watching as China and the United States become bigger rivals. Kishore Mahbubani explains that almost every country, 191 of them, are getting ready for changes because of this competition. Some leaders, like the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, have already said this rivalry affects everyone. The Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Hsien Loong, worried that the US and China might try to force countries to pick sides, instead of working together. Mahbubani points out that many countries aren't just standing by. Even when leaders don't speak up, they're working to protect their own interests. For example, when the US stopped being part of some trade agreements, other countries didn't give up on trade. They made new agreements, like the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, AFCFTA. A huge new trade deal, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, is also coming together in Asia, including China, but not the US. Mahbubani believes this shows that the US strategy of decoupling, separating its economy from China's, isn't very smart, as it could leave the US behind. Mahbubani stresses that neither China nor the US can expect other countries to automatically support them. Each country will look out for itself. He then focuses on how several key countries are responding. Australia is in a tricky spot. It's a close friend of the US for defense and culture, but its economy relies much more on China. Trying to completely separate from China would be bad for Australia's economy. Mahbubani suggests Australia should try to be a neutral helper between the two superpowers. Europe also faces a challenge. While the US wants Europe to side with it against China, Europe is worried about millions of people migrating from Africa. Mahbubani argues that Europe should focus on helping Africa develop and work with China to do so, as this would address its biggest problem. He notes that the US often pressures Europe to follow its lead, but Europe needs to prioritize its own issues. Japan has a complicated history with China, but Mahbubani believes they can find a way to cooperate. He points out the deep cultural connections between the two countries and suggests that a closer relationship could benefit both. He also notes that Japan might need to build stronger ties with China if the US were to reduce its military presence in Asia. India is another important player. Mahbubani believes India should focus on growing its economy and building relationships with both the US and China. He criticizes India for missing opportunities to join trade agreements like RCEP, which could help its economy. He also points out that the US hasn't always treated India with the respect it deserves. Mahbubani highlights the importance of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. He describes it as a geopolitical gift to Australia and New Zealand, providing a buffer between them and China. He believes the US often overlooks the importance of ASEAN, focusing too much on the Middle East. He suggests that the U.S. should pay more attention to Southeast Asia and build stronger relationships with ASEAN countries. Finally, Mahbubani suggests that Russia could become an ally of the U.S. in the future. He argues that Russia, with its long border with China, might want to balance China's growing power by working with the U.S. However, he stresses that this would require the U.S. to acknowledge past mistakes and treat Russia with more respect. He concludes that the U.S. needs to learn from its past and understand that the world is changing. It can no longer rely on emotion, but must use reason and understanding to navigate the new geopolitical landscape. A paradoxical conclusion. Kishore Mahbubani begins by presenting a tricky idea. A big competition between America and China seems unavoidable, but it doesn't have to happen. He believes certain things are pushing the two countries toward conflict, like China accidentally upsetting American businesses and America needing someone to blame for problems at home. It's like when you're having a bad day and find someone to pick on. Sometimes countries do the same thing. Mahbubani points out that many people in America now view China very negatively. He quotes Greg IP from the Wall Street Journal, who noticed a strong push for conflict, with few voices suggesting a calmer approach. Even someone like Hank Paulson, a former Treasury Secretary, feels America has an attitude towards China, not a thoughtful plan. It's as if everyone is yelling about how bad China is, but no one is trying to understand what's really going on or find a way to work together. Roger Cohen, a New York Times writer, even described the situation as an ideological war, with China wanting to run the world, a view Mahbubani strongly disagrees with. The author argues that China isn't trying to force its way of life on others. They simply want to become stronger and more influential, but they don't believe everyone needs to be like them. He uses the idea of yin and yang, a Chinese concept about balance, to explain that China understands different societies have different ways of doing things, unlike America, which sometimes expects everyone to follow its lead. It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. It just doesn't work. Mahbubani worries that this negative feeling towards China and America is so strong that anyone suggesting a more reasonable approach would be criticized. He explains that decisions are often made in separate parts of the government, without considering the bigger picture. For example, when a Chinese official pressures an American company for technology, they might not realize it will anger the American business community. Similarly, the arrest of a Huawei executive, while legally justified, was seen by China as a double standard, because American companies aren't treated the same way when they break the law. It's like getting in trouble for something your friend did. It doesn't feel fair. He also highlights how short-term gains can hurt long-term relationships. China's pressure on Cambodia to block a statement about the South China Sea might have seemed like a win at the time, but it actually made America look better by portraying China as a bully. Similarly, when Hillary Clinton publicly criticized China at a meeting, it might have felt good in the moment, but it made it harder to find common ground. It's like arguing with someone instead of trying to understand their point of view. Mahbubani emphasizes that personalities matter in international relations. He points to the successful relationship between Nixon, Kissinger, Mao, and Zhou Enlai in the 1970s as an example of how strong leadership can overcome differences. He contrasts this with the less comfortable relationship between George W. Bush and Hu Jintao, and criticizes Vice President Pence's harsh speeches about China. It's like having a good teacher versus a strict one. The relationship can make a big difference. Domestic politics also play a role. Mahbubani questions why China included the 9-dash line on its passports, claiming territory in the South China Sea, when it doesn't actually treat those waters as its own. He also mentions how President George H.W. Bush allowed political considerations to influence arms sales to Taiwan. It's like making a decision based on what people want to hear, rather than what's best in the long run. Finally, Mahbubani believes emotions are a powerful force in international relations. He discusses the historical yellow peril fear in the West, suggesting that subconscious biases might influence American reactions to China's rise. He recalls reading stories as a child that portrayed Chinese people negatively, and wonders if those ideas still affect policymakers today. It's like having a hidden prejudice that you don't even realize you have. Despite this pessimistic outlook, Mahbubani argues that a good relationship between America and China is possible. He believes both countries share fundamental interests, like improving the well-being of their citizens. He points out that America spends a huge amount of money on wars, money that could be used to help its own people. He also stresses the importance of cooperation on issues like climate change, arguing that both countries need to work together to protect the planet. It's like being on a sinking ship. You need to work together to survive, even if you don't like each other. Mahbubani identifies 5 areas where America and China don't necessarily contradict each other. He introduces the Chinese concept of non-contradiction, where two seemingly opposite things can both be true. He believes both countries can benefit from cooperation in areas like infrastructure and addressing global challenges. He also notes that China isn't trying to export its political system, and that a clash of civilizations isn't inevitable. It's like realizing that you and your friend have more in common than you thought. Ultimately, Mahbubani believes that if America and China focus on their shared interests and avoid unnecessary conflict, they can both thrive. He concludes that the most important question isn't who wins, but whether humanity as a whole can succeed in creating a better future. And that brings us to the end of our summary of this book. I hope you found it insightful and valuable. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching.